There is no right or wrong way to grieve, but there are healthy ways to deal with the grieving process. What is grief? Grief is a natural response to loss. It is the emotional suffering you feel when something or someone you love is taken away. Often, the pain of loss can feel overwhelming. You may experience all kinds of difficult and unexpected emotions, from shock to anger to disbelief to guilt to profound sadness. The pain of the grief can also disrupt your physical health, making it difficult to sleep, eat, or even think straight. These are normal reactions to loss, and the more significant the loss, the more intense your grief will be. Coping with the loss of someone or something you love is one of life's biggest challenges. You may associate grieving with the death of a loved one, which is often the cause of most intense type of grief. But any loss can cause grief, including divorce, relationships, breakups, loss of health, job, financial stability, miscarriage, retirement, death of a pet, loss of a cherished dream, or a loved one's serious illness. It can also be loss of friendship, loss of safety after a trauma, and selling the family home, anything. Even subtle losses in life can trigger a sense of grief. For example, you might grieve after moving away from home, graduating from college, or changing a job, or after a holiday. So you might feel a sense of loss. Whatever your loss, it's personal to you. So don't feel ashamed about how you feel, or believe that it's somehow only appropriate to grieve for certain things. If the person, animal, relationship or situation was significant to you, it's normal to grieve the loss you're experiencing. Whatever the cause of your grief, there are healthy ways to cope with the pain. That in time can ease your sadness and help you come to terms with your loss. Grieving is highly individual. It is an individual experience. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. How you grieve depends on many factors, including your personality and coping style, your life experiences, your faith, and how significant the loss was to you. Inevitably, the grieving process takes time. Healing happens gradually. It can't be forced or hurried, and there is no normal timetable for grieving. So people start to feel better in weeks and months. For others, the grieving process is measured in years. Whatever your grief experience is, it's important to be patient with yourself and allow the process to naturally unfold. So there are some myths about grief and grieving. Firstly, the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. This is a myth. Trying to ignore your pain or keep it from surfacing will only make it worse in the long run. For real healing, it is necessary to face your grief and actively deal with it. Secondly, it is important to be strong in the face of the loss. This is absolutely a myth, and the reality, the fact is, feeling sad, frightened or lonely is a normal reaction to loss. Crying doesn't mean you are weak. You don't need to protect your family or friends by putting on a brave front. Showing your true feelings can help them and you. Thirdly, if you don't cry, it means you aren't sorry about the loss. I am sorry, but this is a myth. The fact is, crying is a normal response to sadness, but it's not the only one. Those who don't cry may feel the pain just as deeper as the others. They may simply have other ways of showing it. Myth number 4. Grieving should last about a year. Fact is, there are no specific time frames for grieving. How long it takes differs from person to person. And the last myth I would like to address is moving on with your life means forgetting about your loss. The fact is, moving on means you've accepted your loss, but that's not the same as forgetting. You can move on with your life and keep the memory of someone or something you lost as an important part of you. In fact, as we move through life, these memories can become more and more integral to defining the people we are. How to deal with the grieving process? While grieving a loss is an inevitable part of life, there are ways to cope with pain. Come to terms with your grief and eventually find a way to pick up the pieces and move on with your life. Firstly, acknowledge your pain. Secondly, Accept that grief can trigger many different and unexpected emotions. Thirdly, understand that your grieving process will be unique to you. Fourthly, seek out face-to-face support from people who care about you. Fifth, support yourself emotionally by taking care of yourself physically. Sixth, recognize the difference between grief and depression. Today I am going to talk about the 5 stages of grief. It was designed by Elizabeth Kuber Ross in 1969. These stages of grief were based on her studies of the feeling of the patients facing terminal illness. But people have generalized them to other types of negative life changes and losses, such as the death of a loved one or a breakup. So, the 5 stages of grief are: denial. In this stage, the world becomes meaningless and overwhelming. Life makes no sense. We are in a state of shock and denial. We go numb. We wonder how we can go on, if we can go on, whether we should go on. We try to find a way to simply get through each day. Denying the loss just gives you more time to gradually observe the news and begin to process it. For example, in a state of shock, you might say your first reaction would be, why is this happening to me? Or probably in the state of denial, you might say after a breakup that they're just upset, they'll be over this tomorrow and everything will be fine. But in reality, it's just nature's way to let in only as much as we can handle. Where denial may be considered a coping mechanism, anger is a masking effect. Anger is hiding many of the emotions and pain that you carry. This anger may be redirected at other people, such as the person who died, your ex, or your old boss. You may even aim your anger at inanimate objects. Anger tends to be more socially acceptable than admitting we are scared. Anger allows us to express emotions with less fear of judgment or rejection. So, unfortunately, anger tends to be the first thing we feel when we start to release emotions related to loss. Like after a breakup, you might say, I hate him, he'll regret leaving me. Or after losing a job, you might say, they're terrible bosses, I hope they fail. Bargaining. In this stage, you are desperately willing to do almost anything to alleviate or minimize the pain. Losing a loved one can cause us to consider any way we could avoid the current pain or the pain we are anticipating from the loss. In this process, we might bargain with God, saying, God, if you can heal this person, I will turn my life around. Or with a higher power, saying, I promise to be a better person if you let this person live. It is also common to recall times when we may have said things we did not mean and we wish we could go back and behave differently. We also tend to make the drastic assumption that if things had played out differently, we would not be in such an emotionally painful place in our lives. Depression. There comes a time when our imaginations calm down and we slowly start to look at the reality of our present situation. Bargaining no longer feels like an option and we are faced with what is happening. We start to feel our loss of our loved one even more abundantly. As our panic begins to subside, the emotional fog begins to clear and the loss feels more presentable and unavoidable. Also, you might be surrounded with depressive thoughts like, what am I without her after a breakup? Or I don't know how to go forward from here. My whole life comes to this terrible end. Like other stages of grief, depression can be difficult and messy. It can feel overwhelming. You may also choose to isolate yourself from others in order to fully cope with the loss. Depression seems like an inevitable part of any loss. But if you feel stuck here or can't seem to move past this stage of grief, talk to a mental health expert. A therapist can help you work through this period of coping. Acceptance. Acceptance is not necessarily a happy or uplifting stage of grief. It doesn't mean you've moved past your grief or loss. It does, however, mean that you accepted it and have come to understand what it means in your life now. For instance, when you finally come to terms with a breakup or divorce, you might say this was a healthy choice for me after all. Or after a death of a loved one, you might say, I am so fortunate to have had so many wonderful years with him and he will always be in my memories. However, not everyone who grieves goes through all of these stages, and that's okay. Contrary to the popular belief, you do not have to go through each stage in order to heal. In fact, some people resolve their grief without going through any of these stages. If you do go through these stages of grief, you probably won't experience them in a neat linear order. So don't worry about what you should be feeling or which stage you're supposed to be in. Symptoms of grieving. Just remember that almost anything that you experience in the early stage of grief is normal, including feeling like you're going crazy, feeling like you're in a bad dream, or questioning your religious or spiritual beliefs. Emotional symptoms of grief. Shock and disbelief. Right after a loss, it can be really hard to accept what happened. You may feel numb, have trouble believing that the loss really happened, or even deny the truth. If someone you love has died, you may keep expecting them to show up even though you know they are gone. Secondly, sadness. Sadness is another emotional response. Profound sadness is probably the most universally experienced symptom of grief. You may have feelings of emptiness, despair, yearning, or deep loneliness. You may also cry a lot and feel emotionally unstable. Guilt. You may regret or feel guilty about things you did or didn't say or do. You may feel guilty about certain feelings also, like, for example, feeling relieved when the person died after a long, difficult illness. After a death, you may even feel guilty for not doing something to prevent the death, even if there was nothing more you could have done. Anger. Even if the loss was nobody's fault, you may feel angry and resentful. If you lost a loved one, you may be angry with yourself, God, or the doctors, or even the person who died for abandoning you. You may feel the need to blame someone for the injustice that was done to you. Fear. The significant loss can trigger a host of worries and fears. You may feel anxious, helpless, or insecure. You may even have a panic attack. The death of a loved one can trigger fears about your own mortality, of facing the life without that person, or the responsibilities you now face alone. Physical symptoms of grief. Now, there are some physical symptoms of grief too, like fatigue, nausea, lowered immunity, weight loss, weight gain, aches or pains, insomnia, or disturbed sleep.